is we are going to start with verse 7. We're going to look at a story this morning about two people, two very different people that had kind of the same problem. One was the man of God, Elijah. He had just come onto the scene here. It's his first entrance into the biblical story in chapter 17. He had just started and he was already causing problems for our king Ahab. The second person we're going to start at, talk about today was a widow. And she was a poor widow. She was not an Israelite. She was a Gentile woman. She lived way up north of where Ahab ruled, or where Elijah usually spoke. But they met, and it was God's plan. And it was a miracle. And we're going to see how that works this morning. Okay? Let's just get a little bit of perspective. We've got Ahab, and I don't know what you've heard about Ahab, but he was a bad guy. Really bad guy. It says he was the worst of all the kings. By that time, the Israelites couldn't get along with each other, and they had split the kingdom in two. The northern half was Israel, and the bottom half was Judah. He was king over Israel. Constantly, the two kings of those areas were fighting. But Ahab had a lot of problems. He was the worst king. It says in the chapter right before, in 16, Ahab did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. And later on it says that he did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger him than did all the kings of Israel before him. Wow. He was a bad guy. Plus he married Jezebel. If you had come to the Bible study about Jezebel, she was just as bad as him. No worse. So we've got this interesting dynamic going on in Israel, and then here comes Elijah. I mean, he just sort of pops on the scene and says to Ahab, you're messing up, and there's not going to be rain until I say so. And then he leaves, and no wonder Ahab didn't really care for Elijah. I mean, if you know the Bible stories, he's always putting down Elijah. Why are you bothering me? And you're my enemy, and all these kind of things. And that's why, because Ahab would pop up and say, you're doing wrong, But that's the story that we're in right now. Elijah has come, and he said, Ahab, it's not going to be rain. And so God told Elijah, you better go hide. Because he knew Ahab, and he knew Jezebel, and he needed to hide. So he went in and hid, and he said, the brook right here, this brook is going to give you water, and the ravens are going to bring you food. They're going to bring you bread and meat, morning and night. So here was Elijah. Everybody else, there was a drought. They were having problems, but Elijah was by a brook. And the ravens brought him food night and day. So then we start with verse 7. So here's the story. That's kind of the background. And here we go. In verse 7 it says, sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So eventually, as would happen, the brook dried up. And Elijah is wondering what is going to happen now. And here we have his problem, his plight. He is out of water. And I don't know if the ravens were still coming, but when you're out of water, you need to move, right? I mean, you need to go. So God comes and he says, I go to Zarephath. Now, the thing about Zarephath was, it was this coastal town on the Mediterranean. I don't know about you, but it sounds pretty good to me, Like, that sounds like a good place to go. And then he says, I've commanded a widow to give you food. And Elijah's thinking to himself, I don't know much about widows, but usually not wealthy. You know what I mean? Like, probably doesn't have a lot, but I'm going to do what God tells me to do. And that's one thing about Elijah. He did always do what God told him to do. And we know ahead of time that the widow, God had already spoken to her. I've commanded a widow, he says, to provide you with food. So spoke to Elijah. He's got a problem. His brook's dried up and he needs water. And we've spoken to this widow. Well, we know that if she's a widow, she already has a problem. She doesn't have family. She doesn't have support. So there's her problem. And pretty soon these two people are going to meet and we're going to see what God does. But let's go to verse 10. Sorry. So he went to Zarephath. Now he had a choice, right? It was about 80 to 100 miles between the place where he was hiding and the place in Zarephath. So he went. And when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked her, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I can have a drink?" Of course, after all this way, he has, he's thirsty. So he sees her, but I started thinking about this. So he goes to Zarephath, and there she is at the gate. So I looked up some stuff about gates, and the gate, you know, there would be a wall around the city, and then there would be the gate, and of course everyone who worked outside of the city would go in and out of that gate every day. But it wasn't only used for that, it was used to meet for a meeting place. If you wanted to meet a friend, you'd say, "Hey, meet me at the gate," you know, and we'd go from there. Or when the elders convened and they talked, they would meet at the gate. When we see Boaz wanting to get Ruth as his wife, he went to the gate and then had this great meeting, right? And gave his shoe and the exchange of shoes and whatever that meant in that day, we don't know. Or if there was a king of the town, he would go there to meet people and to give instructions and all these things. So the gate was really a place where people met. It was the town square. It was all of these things. And I started thinking about this woman, and it says here that she was gathering sticks. Well, I started thinking about the gate, and I'm thinking, that's probably not the best place to find sticks. You know, like the meeting place, probably clean, probably not a lot of, you know, I don't know, trees around, maybe. And she's gathering sticks at the gate. I don't know. I personally think she was waiting for Elijah to come, the prophet, who she was supposed to supply with food, and we'll see later, she didn't have much. So I think she was kind of waiting there to see who was going to show up and what they were going to say. And what's the first thing he says to her? He says, "Could you bring me a little bit of water?" And let's see her reaction. Verse 11. As she was going to get it, he called. So, wow, she was happy, I think. I mean, she was pretty happy. Like, water? No problem. We got water. I'm going to go get you some right now. I'm quickly going before you ask me anything else. Water I got. Dude, I can help you out. Right? But he says, so she's going. He's seeing the back of her head. She is on her way. I mean, she is going. She's taking whatever sticks that she found at the gate, which I don't think was very many myself. And she is on her way to get water. But what does he say to her? The end of 11. He called, which means she was going, right? He had to call, not just say, call. And bring me, please, a piece of bread. So she's fine with the water. She's good. She's on her way. She's bringing that water. I mean, she is going so fast. But then he says, and, excuse me, lady, could you bring me a piece of bread? And that's when she turned around, and here's what she says. Verse 12, as surely as the Lord your God lives. As surely as the Lord your God lives. Every other time that I have read over that passage, I've skipped that. Because I thought, well, yeah, of course, as surely as the Lord your God lives. And then she goes on to say, that's just something they said, you know, like, I swear, or I'm telling the truth, or whatever. But no, she was a Gentile. She didn't even live in Israel. You know what she was saying? She was saying, I know you're a prophet of God, and that your God lives. And he proves it later, right? We haven't got to Mount Carmel and all the prophets or anything, but he proves it later. But this woman she's giving him a profession of faith. She knew about God, and she says, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and then let's go on. She replied, I don't have any bread. Water I got. I don't have any bread. Here's her situation. We've already seen Elijah's situation. He's running from Ahab. He's got a dry brook. He's traveling to the coast. And here's hers. I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die.
How sad.
That was her situation. She had nothing. She didn't have any bread to bring back to the man of God. She knew that he was the man of God and that his God lived. But she didn't have the ability to help him. She had nothing. She had nothing. And I believe, I can't prove it, but I believe she was waiting by the gate so that he wouldn't come to her house and say, give me bread. I think she met him halfway. Dude, I cannot help you. God told me to help you. I do not have the ability to help you. I have nothing in my house. I have a little bit. I'm making the last fire. I'm cooking the last piece of bread. My son and I will eat it. And then that's it for us. That's it. And you said how sad, right? It is. It's a terrible situation that this woman was in. And what do you think Elijah said to her? Let's find out, right? She had the ability to give him water. She did. Her dilemma was that no bread. So here we go, verse 13. And Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. We see that a lot in the Bible, don't we? Like the angels show up and people are, afraid. Don't be afraid, fear not, or don't be afraid about this. Or God says to Joshua, you're going to go conquer the Jericho. Don't be afraid. All these situations where fear is like the obvious reaction, right? And so she's worried. She's not only has herself, she has some sort of child, and we learn later it was a small child. So she has a small child. She's worried about herself. And he says, don't be afraid. I'll tell you what you're going to do, is what he says, right? Go home and do as you have said. So he gives her directions, right? Don't be afraid. Do what you said. And here's the kicker, though, right? But first, he says, don't be afraid. Go ahead, do what you said. You're going to mix up your flour, your oil. Do that. But first, and she's like, but first, what am I going to do? But first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Now, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, good for you, Elijah. At least he said small, right? At least he didn't say, bring me a big old loaf of bread. He said to her, but first, bring me a small cake of bread. And I was like, well, good. At least he said small.
Yeah. He wasn't greedy.
She can wrap her head around small, I think, But he wanted it first. This was the man of God speaking. It was God's words. Don't be afraid. Do what you said. But first, take care of me. God's already told you that you need to. And I'm confirming what God told you earlier. But first, make a small cake of bread for me and from what you have and bring it to me. And then, and I read this again and it's like, make the bread, bring it out to me, then go back. I don't know if there's significance in that, but he wanted his bread. I think he was pretty hungry. Anyway, and he says, and then make something for yourself and your son. And I wonder what she thought about that. Don't be afraid. I get your situation. I get what's going on. But first, do what God said. Provide something for me. And then go home and make something for your son. And she's probably thinking, well, I think I thoroughly explained my situation. Just a little bit of flour, just a little bit of oil. If I make something for you, there is not going to be anything when I get back. So I don't know how, see, because I think while she was trying to look for sticks at the gate, which of course I believe she found very few there, I think she was doing the little rehearsal in her head. Have you ever done that? You're like, I know somebody's going to come ask me, and I'm rehearsing what I'm going to say to them, what my whole spiel is going to be, you know. So I think she rehearsed it, and she couldn't have been any more clear. This is all I have, and he was asking for that. He was asking for all she had, really, at that point. Make me something, and then go back. But here's verse 14. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. So she's a Gentile woman. She's recognized that his God is living. And he says, I want you to do this because this is what the Lord of Israel says, God of Israel says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land. The flour will not be used up, and the oil will not run dry until the Lord gives rain in the land. Incredible. She had to believe that, but that's incredible, isn't it? To me, this verse, it's the key verse, really. It's the key verse to the whole passage. And he is saying to her, God is in charge of your situation. Your flour, do what I ask. Obey, trust, obey, listen, obey what I'm saying. Your flour will not be gone. Every day when you go, this is what he's saying to her. Every day when you go, there'll be flour. Every day when you go, there'll be oil. God is in charge of your provisions, your resources, your situation. Until the day that God gives rain on the land. So even bigger than her kitchen and her oil and her flour, he's in charge of the rain. God's going to give the rain. So he was in charge of her relatively small situation, not to her, of course, it was huge to her, but one woman's kitchen, God was in charge of that. But the rain for the whole area, he was in charge of that too. God is in control of her resources and the drought. I mean, at that point, Elijah's saying, God's in control of everything. You obey, and it's going to work out great for you.
Praise the Lord.
And for him, I mean, he was going to get he was going to get the first cake of bread, and then they were both going to get their situations taken care of.
Thank you, Jesus.
He was thirsty and hungry. She was about to be. And God put the two together in order to do this miracle and take care of both of them.
Amen.
Thank you, Lord.
Verse 15. She went away and did as Elijah told her. So that was her. I mean, verse 14 is the key because it sums it up, but that was her act of faith. She went away and did what Elijah told her, which was, don't be afraid, do what you have said, make me some food first, and bring it to me. And she did that, it says. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. The drought lasted for 3.5 years. We don't know how long it was until the brook dried up, but a good portion of 3.5 years, God made a way for this woman to supply the man of God with food and took care of her family too. Is that incredible? I mean, they both had some fairly serious problems, but the obedience of both. He went to her, she did what he asked, and they both got a miracle. So why would I go through this story? What is the usefulness of this story to us? Because that's, after all, that's why we read this, right? Because yay for Elijah and the widow, but this is more than just a story. It's God's word to us.
Yeah.
So number one, God is in control of your situation. God has not been surprised about anything that has happened to you. He will not be surprised about anything that happens to you. He is in control of your resources and all that you have, and he is in charge of the big picture as well.
Thank you, Jesus.
Right?
Hallelujah.
We have to believe that. I mean, sometimes we say, why isn't God helping? What is God doing? For me, he's not, he couldn't be, but he is. He is in charge of our situations. And maybe you're saying, well, my situation's not bad, but I know somebody, my niece, my son, my grandson, my uncle, my somebody has got a bad situation. Well, I'm going to ask you today to have faith for that situation too. God is in control. And he works things out. I think sometimes about the fact that in this story, Elijah had to travel so far. And while he's traveling, this woman is running out. I mean, she was on her last day, right? And as he's getting there to give her the word, she's looking and she's eating a little bit less, as moms would, to give her son a little bit more, and she's conserving and she's doing whatever she can. She's running out. And all the while, Elijah is on his way to her with the solution. So if you see a situation in your life or in someone else's life, know that God has someone on the way, has something in the mail, has something happening. He puts all these things together like a big puzzle, and he works them out. But number two, we have to listen and obey, don't we?
Amen.
If that woman had said, I don't believe you, and I can't. I mean, can you imagine the choice that she had to make? That little bit of flour that she'd been conserving for days, maybe weeks, and the little bit of oil. She poured it in, she made it up, she gave it to him. She had to decide to obey. Even the hardest thing that she'd probably ever done is make that bread for him. And then go back and look at her sons. I mean, her son's probably sitting at the table waiting for that. When she told him she was gathering sticks, coming back, he's probably waiting, when's lunch, And she's like, let me there's a guy in the gate, and he's, okay. I mean, it's everyday choices, right?
Amen.
She decided to obey. And Elijah did too. I mean, he traveled out of his own country to a widow. The prospects of a widow giving him food, I don't know, maybe not so great, but he did too. So they had to listen and they had to obey. And number three, I only had two originally on this list. God is in control of your situation and other people's. 2, listen and obey. But 3rd, support each other. We're not in this alone. Elijah was not alone. The widow was not alone. And we are not alone. We have a body of people And it's bigger than us, right? We saw that at the picnic. That was what was cool about the picnic, right? Mm-hmm. All of those other people love Jesus too. All of those other people are going through their own things. They're searching the Word. They're doing their daily life. We have all these. We have this support group, and we have to support each other, because that's when these two people met. The word of the Lord came down, she obeyed, and there was food. Now, as the story goes on, her son gets sick and dies. And Elijah is able to call out to God and raise her son. So thank God he was there, right? I mean, if that was the whole purpose, we don't know. But he was there for that time too. That's later on in the chapter. So let me just go through. God is in control of your situation. But we must listen and obey. And we must support each other. That's what this story is about. So let's pray.